Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me by video link today, we have Charles Malet and Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, both. Now, we are getting kicked off here with the NATO summit, and, well, the family photo has been taken. This began yesterday, but Keir Starmer appears to be missing in action. Apparently, he didn't manage to get there in time for the family photograph, and they didn't want to wait for him to turn up. Now, as you may have seen, bright and sunny here in Plymouth, not so bright and sunny at the summit. It's being described as gloomy. And why would that be? Well, first of all, because Ukraine's losing. That's the main issue for them. But also, they're particularly concerned about the mental acumen, let's say, of the man in the middle there at the front, Joe Biden. But Joe, of course, got on stage and the first thing he did as he opened the conference, because he got to open the conference, was to announce 5 new strategic air defense systems for Ukraine. And so we get the theme, the war narrative is going to continue. Eventually, Keir Starmer did turn up. So here he is arriving in Britain's equivalent of Air Force One, which is really exciting. Well, what did he do? Well, he, of course, said that, we are going to continue funding and supplying weapons to Ukraine. But on top of that, don't worry, Ukrainians, you make a decision what you're going to do with Storm Shadow missiles. Fire them into Russia as much as you like, because that's your decision. And of course, firing them into Russia would be a purely defensive thing. But it got even better, because gloomy or not, one person had a smile on his face, and that is Jens Stoltenberg, who was honoured apparently and humbled to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Joe Biden. I'm not sure whether Joe knew what he was doing. He was just following the actions as usual, I suppose. So that's the war situation. That's what's going on in Washington for the 75th anniversary of NATO, purely defensive alliance, prosecuting wars right across the world. In the meantime, a massive furore over the actions of Viktor Orban. Here he is. This is what he said whenever Hungary and he took over the presidency of the European Council. What we can do is what is always the job of the presidency to do, to put the proposals on the table. So we won't be deciding, but we'll help the 27 prime ministers to decide. We'll be there in all the places that are important for Europe. We'll explore all the situations. So he decided that, having assumed the presidency of the European Council, that he would fly off to Kiev. Here he is. A few days ago, he met Zelensky, of course, with an effort to pull together a peace deal. He left Zelensky and flew off to Moscow, where he met President Putin. And this absolutely had the whole of Europe, as we'll see in a second, in a spin. And then he flew off to China, where he met with Xi Jinping. And this was really pretty unprecedented. And as I say, the Europeans absolutely upset about it, as we're going to see. So let's start off with Ursula von der Leyen. Hungarian PM Viktor Orban is visiting Moscow. Appeasement will not stop Putin. Only unity and determination will pave the path to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. So Orban's there trying to organize peace. Ursula is still agitating for war. Charles Michel, the same. The EU rotating presidency has no mandate to engage with Russia on behalf of the EU. The European Council is clear. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. No discussions about Ukraine can take place without Ukraine. But, of course, the first place he stopped was in Ukraine. So I'm not quite sure that Charles Michel thinking straight there. It gets even better. Donald Tusk, of course, Prime Minister of Poland, now that he's left, he was previous president of one of the 3 EU bodies. PM Orban on his way to Moscow. We will serve as an important tool in making the first step towards peace, is the quote from Orban. The question is in whose hands this tool is. And then we've got Olaf Scholz. Orban travels to Putin as Hungarian Prime Minister. The European Council is represented in foreign policy by Charles Michel. So they're all really desperate to make sure that he's put in his place. And similar from the Lithuanian Prime Minister, the Latvian Prime Minister, the Estonian Prime Minister, the Finnish Prime Minister, the Swedish Prime Minister, and the Czech Prime Minister. And the Danish Prime Minister. So the absolute furore over this. But in the meantime, then we have Orban back in the EU, setting up his Patriots for Europe group with more and more people organising around him for this. So France 24 getting very excited about this situation. And the headline here, Le Pen, Orban and the Patriots for Europe, is the EU being undermined from within? Well, if suing for peace is some kind of undermining of the European Union, then perhaps that is what they are doing. So I just want to highlight this tweet from Kenneth Roth, who of course is chairman of the Human Rights Watch. And he said, at stake in the French and US elections are the defense of Ukraine's democratic future from Putin's colonial invasion, and with it the prospects for democracy in Europe. The far right has a different plan. And I replied by saying, peace, you mean? And Vanessa, I'll start by welcoming you to the programme first and say, it is quite incredible to me that the far right is now being criticised and, well, first of all, is taking this position as opposed to the liberal elites who are pursuing war as fast as they possibly can. But it's down to the far right to attempt to negotiate peace and being heavily criticised for that.
Yeah, I mean, in France, it's not only the far right, it's also what is considered to be the far left, which is the Popular Coalition. And Mélenchon is getting heavily criticized again for basically taking a position of peace on almost every single issue. I mean, it's extraordinary times that we're living in, where people who are literally brokering peace and an end to war are being vilified and ostracized and absolutely demonized. It's quite extraordinary.
Yes, Charles, I don't know, I'm sort of hijacking you here, but have you got any thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, I think Vanessa's quite right. It's really, this is an extension, certainly in the United Kingdom, of the reframing of the terminology surrounding the far right and extremism. And it seems now that peace is yet another sort of qualifying criteria that's been lumped in with all the others. And it is quite extraordinary. I mean, to see Orban attacked for reasons, in effect, that are not directly the reasons that anyone really wants to declare. Of course, it's effectively attack by subterfuge, but really it goes at his politics and indeed all the vested interests involved in prosecuting war by proxy in Ukraine. It is absolutely shocking, but to see that nobody apparently will stand up in defence of what he's doing and of peace is a terrible indictment on the people that are supposed to be taking part in shaping their countries for the benefit of those living in them.
Indeed. Now, an issue that I've been talking about for a little while now is this whole business of sexual violence as a mechanism for being used in warfare, and the fact that the British government has been arguing against it for quite a long time. And my point has been, Charles, that, well, just stop the wars and then it wouldn't be a feature of warfare. But bring us up to date on this.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, well, I think there's really a different or perhaps additional dimension to it, because as you say, to cite there being a problem with sexual violence as an instrument of war is overlooking the fact that war in itself is, of course, an enormous problem, especially if, bearing in mind the last segment, war is not going to be put off in the name of peace. But yeah, so as a way of sort of exemplifying how this is now weaponized against, in this case, I would say Russia. We'll look at the statement put out by Deirdre Brown in recognition of the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, which actually took place back on the 19th of June. But this is a speech that she gave in Vienna on the 5th of July. And the text of it, I would say, points very much towards it being used as a means by which to attack Russia. So she says that they mark the International Day, they pay tribute to the victims, survivors, and those around the world who dedicate their lives to ending conflict-related sexual violence. Okay, fair enough to a point, notwithstanding Mike's caveat. But in the OSCE region, mounting evidence of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war indicate its potential use as a tactic of war. So straight away, there's a focus, even though this is supposed to be about an international day. And she goes on to say, successive Moscow mechanism reports have documented the considerable scale of reported acts of sexual violence and so forth during their war of aggression against Ukraine. So it's the same language coming out, this war, the war of aggression against Ukraine, with no sort of qualification of what exactly she's talking about. And I've now got a slide from the 24th of April when Mike spoke about this, and indeed Barbara Woodward talking about the commitment to reduce or deal with this, but without actually going so far as to stop war. But they've referred to the Moscow mechanism by the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. So I thought we'd just have a look at that and to see how this in effect comes about. So the Moscow mechanism, established by all OSCE participating states in 1991, allows for one or more participating states to request ODIHR, which stands for the Office of Democratic Institutions and of Human Rights, to inquire of another participating state whether it would agree to invite a mission of experts to address a particular clearly defined question on its territory relating to the human dimension. Well, we'll come back to the human dimension, but of course, we have to consider, therefore, who are the participating states. And as I've put in red text at the bottom there, although not exclusively, of the 57 participants, they are largely derived from members of the EU and NATO. So it's not really a great surprise to see that they might commission a report that has the specific remit to investigate actions by Russia. And of course, the report finds that Russia is at fault. So I thought it would be worth casting our eyes a bit further back. And here we've got 2018 report from the State Department in United States, in which they talk about human rights in the Donbass region, and saying that government and pro-government forces, as in Ukrainian government and pro-government forces, at times committed abuses, including torture against individuals detained on national security grounds. Further, they go on to say that according to NGOs, abuses included beatings, forced labor, psychological and physical torture, public humiliation, and sexual violence. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine continued to document reports of sexual and gender-based violence by both sides during the year. So the point of this is not really to say that Russia hasn't done this and Ukraine has, but it's really to point out that this is just yet another way in which Russia is demonized. And effectively, the vehicle here is the elimination of Sexual Violence Day, which has been hijacked to make a point of casting Russia as the bad guys. And I thought I'd draw you back to UK column content from 2008, in which Mike wrote about the then situation in Georgia, an article entitled "Encirclement of Russia Continues." And I've just taken a quote out of this, which says, while NATO continues to inflame the situation, Russia continues its diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. And here we are, almost 20 years on, or at least getting on for 20 years on, and nothing has changed. So we'll look again at NATO, and of course they refer to corruption and as though it's in hand in glove with conflict, and actually with specific regard to Ukraine. This again was from a 2018 article, and they say that the impact of corruption on national security, sovereignty and independence has been well illustrated by the developments in Ukraine. And yet, of course, now we've had something of a whitewash, and it's not seen like that at all in the mainstream. But again, here we have a quote from former US President then, Joe Biden, stating in 2009 that Russia over the last decade or so has used another foreign policy weapon. It uses corruption as a tool of coercion to keep Ukraine vulnerable and dependent. So he's talking about reform with that in mind. And I think that's very pertinent. It shows how long pushing Ukraine to the fore has been part of the agenda with which to destabilize Russia. but also it gives an insight into, certainly to Mike's last segment, as to why actions of people like Viktor Orban are so well resisted. And on Monday's news, Brian showed a brief mention of the Telegraph article that said that Ukraine was to be told it's too corrupt to join NATO. So I thought we'd just go through the background to that and look at the NATO website as it was yesterday during, of course, the summit that Mike's mentioned. But in particular, relations with Ukraine and how this suits the other organizations that are part of NATO at the moment. So they say that the situation is regularly addressed through the annual national program, the ANP. NATO will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. So effectively, it's always a sort of movable feast, and Ukraine are constantly led to believe that they will absolutely become a member of NATO, but it's not quite clear when. So specifically, they talk about reforms needing to happen relating to good governance, the fight against corruption, the rule of law, human rights, and the security and defence sector in accordance with Euro-Atlantic principles and standards. So just to conclude, it seems very much that the tone of the summit now, of course, is that weapons will continue to pour into Ukraine, and it suits NATO and allies, and certainly the sort of EU bloc, very well to continue to be able to do this, because of course if Ukraine were a member of NATO, that would absolutely change the situation for all the other members of NATO due to Article 5, which Mark again was explaining about on Monday. So to keep Russia at arm's length by a proxy war is of benefit to all the states that are currently doing that at the moment, and of course to the defence industry. So it's very hard to see how that will change, and certainly something that we'll be interested to see develop as the week goes on.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Vanessa. Let's come on to Gaza then. And well, the Lancet has been publishing some information on death statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much focused on Gaza today in all my reports because the IOF brutality and savagery has increased exponentially across the enclave, and areas are being re-invaded, re-bombarded since people have actually returned to already bombarded areas considered to be safe after the withdrawal of the Israeli forces. So this came out, it was published on the 5th. Counting the dead in Gaza is difficult but essential. So let's have a look at what it actually says. It's a relatively short report. So it talks about the armed conflicts that have indirect health implications beyond the direct harm from violence. Even if the conflict ends immediately, there will continue to be many indirect deaths in the coming months and years from causes such as reproductive, communicable and non-communicable diseases. The total death toll is expected to be large given the intensity of the conflict. Destroyed healthcare infrastructure, severe shortages of, it's not exactly just severe shortages, they are being deliberately starved. The shortage of water and shelter. Shelter has, of course, been destroyed. Also, water plants have been destroyed. Processing plants have been destroyed. The population's inability to flee to safe places, and the loss of funding to UNRWA, one of the very few humanitarian organizations still active in the Gaza Strip. And of course, we know it isn't still active because Israel has prevented any activity by UNRWA inside Gaza. It goes on to say in recent conflicts, such indirect deaths range from 3 to 15 times the number of direct deaths, applying a conservative estimate of 4 indirect deaths per 1 direct death to the 37 or let's say 38,000 deaths reported. It's not implausible to estimate that up to 186,000 or even more deaths could be attributable to the current conflict in Gaza, and bearing in mind at least 50% of that number will probably be children. Using the 2022 Gaza Strip population estimate of 2.3 million, this would translate to 7.9 of the total population in the Gaza Strip. And a report from February the 7th, 2024, at the time when the direct death toll was 28,000, estimated that without a ceasefire, there would be between 58.2 thousand deaths without an epidemic or escalation, and 85,750 deaths if both occurred by August the 6th, 2024. I mean, horrifying numbers. And actually, funnily enough, there have been a spate of videos from British Palestinian doctors in particular who've managed to enter Gaza and who are working in the decimated hospital systems there. And this is one doctor, Dr. Ahmed, who's working at the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah, which is another area that was relatively safe for about a week or so and is now under heavy artillery fire. So let's just have a look at whether his testimony bears out what the Lancet has said.
This is especially poignant and hard to speak about, given what happened yesterday. There was a bombing of one of the schools, and we had child after child after child get brought into the resuscitation room with different extents of traumatic injury. Standing over one child intubated with a depressed skull fracture, another with a shrapnel injury, probably 10 years old, so severe that we could see an exposed kidney and likely a transected spinal cord, trying to rush them to the OR to salvage what we could. And then in the backdrop, as a pediatrician, I see small children sitting in the corner with lesser physical traumatic injuries, but no doubt witnessing death and destruction and dying in a way that their little brains and could never be capable of coping with. And so the bleeding has to stop, the bombs have to stop, and access to all types of humanitarian have to be allowed. If there's any doubt from anybody whether or not humanitarian aid has been allowed, I can promise you the answer is no. The number is underestimated. And the reason I say this is, as a medical professional, this ICU where I work today is full of DKA patients, diabetic patients, who get a very treatable disease, but they're dying of the most simple thing because the insulin is unavailable, because they're not allowed to bring it in, and refrigeration is gone. There are people dying of chronic, as many amputees as they are from the trauma. There's amputees of diabetes uncontrolled. And these people will be permanently disabled after this war. The numbers are vastly high. I would say 4, 5, 6 times higher easily.
Sorry, I think he was actually from the US, and he mentioned that he brought around 6 suitcases full of medicines that had been donated. All of them were seized by the Israeli authorities. Then I just wanted to point out that in the last 24 hours, Israel has bombarded children's football match in the Al-Auda school in central Gaza in Khan Yunis. So let's just have a look at the video. There are distressing scenes in this video.
ضوء فيش هذا فيش واو كل مرة تسلم الجرة وعبار فانتسي وهاي الحارس
30 people at least killed in that attack and dozens more injured. No terrorists, just kids trying to unwind and play football. And I just wanted to point out, you mentioned the demonization of Russia in Ukraine, and we have a perfect example when it comes to actually holding Israel to account for the crimes it is obviously committing. This is Keir Starmer's response, and on the other side is his immediate demonization of Russia over the alleged bombing in Ukraine. So let's just roll this.
I don't think is wise, and this is, we're always being asked to do this, is for politicians to sit looking at clips on social media or on programmes and forming instant judgments about whether it's a breach of this law or that. That doesn't seem to be wise, but
when it comes to Russia, it's perfectly acceptable. Extraordinary hypocrisy.
Indeed. Indeed. Don't really know what to say about that. Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay. If you like what the UK column does, you would like to support us, the place to go is support.ukcolumn.org. Options to help us out there. We do need your support. So if you can help, please do. But whether or not you choose to do that, please do share material. We are being censored on the various platforms, the Facebook being the latest of them. And so we need your help to get the reach that the algorithms will not provide. So if you can help us with that, that would be great too. And please do pick something up at the UK Column shop if you would like to, not least Your Life in Their Hands, which many people in the chat box have noticed is sitting on the shelf behind Charles there. So thank you very much for that, Charles. But Charles, tomorrow at 1 p.m, you are interviewing Laura Damaret. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Well, I was unsure as well, but no, it's Demaret. Laura Demaret is a registered nurse in Idaho. She is absolutely a ball of energy and now wisdom. She's been effectively applying the principles that are set out in the doctrine of the lesser magistrates and using interposition, the practice of interposition. And she's been approaching county boards and effectively getting legislation put in place or policies changed according to stopping mRNA COVID vaccines from harming people. And this is because of what she saw working in the care sector very early on in 2020. And she was absolutely appalled. And so she's gone out and done something on her own. Obviously as part of a large network, but she's got off her backside and done it. And it's a very, very impressive story of how to take on the authorities and succeed. So I really would encourage people to tune in and find out how to get amongst it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charles. And another reminder of a date for your diary, which is Saturday, the 19th of October. The place is Bristol, and we will be really live that day. And so we do encourage, as soon as we make the details available of it for it, which will be very, very soon now, we encourage you to come along and join us for that. The question is change. This is what Keir Starmer says we're going to see. And the first change, perhaps, is the latest buzzwords of the day from the Labour government, and that is mission-driven government. So I'm sorry to do this to you, but let's just have a listen to, very briefly, Ed Miliband talking about mission-driven government.
The government's mission is clean power by 2030. We are a department of the brightest and the best driving that mission. And as part of that, I'm delighted to say that we have recruited Chris Stark, former Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, widely admired and respected around the world, to lead the mission. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, it's the opportunity of a lifetime, and I mean that. We are going to get this mission done. It is the gateway to the full decarbonisation of this economy, and I couldn't resist it. I'm so pleased to be here.
That's what we mean by mission-driven government.
So there you go, the brightest and the best. I hope everybody found the humour in that. But let's have a look and see. This is the man that we just saw on screen with Ed Miliband, Chris Stark, head of mission control for head of mission control for Clean Power 2030. This is the new organisation they're setting up. They're calling it Mission Control for Clean Power. We have no details exactly what that means just yet, but let's look at some of the words from the press release. Under Chris Stark's leadership, a top team of energy experts will break down barriers and accelerate progress on energy projects. Mission Control will be a one-stop shop, bringing together a top team of industry experts and officials to troubleshoot, negotiate and clear the way for energy projects. But Chris Stark isn't just the new head of Mission Control for Clean Power. He's also the head of the Carbon Trust, who work with all kinds of organizations. GSK is just one of them, many other organizations, to try and help them meet their carbon targets. So, Charles, I don't know what you make of that, but we both thought that Ed Miliband's video clip was, well, frankly, hilarious.
Well, it's nice to see him again, isn't it? I think, the Chris Stark press release sounded a little bit like it was written in 1997 and it's been sort of kept in a drawer somewhere to be brought out now. But I think really the more serious point to be drawn out of it is now the suggestion, exactly like you say, we're talking about change, talking about sort of mission-led government and all this kind of thing. But we're now led to believe that climate and energy are completely inextricably linked, and that everything that concerns energy also concerns climate, which of course means that we never, in fact, examine any of the science behind the suggestion that either the climate is changing or that it's changing for the worse, or that we have anything to do with the fact that it is changing. and the area that I'm going to talk about now, which was an immediate announcement. You'd think of all the things they could have talked about, but the one thing that really that was pushed out hard was onshore wind, and a policy statement on onshore wind, which we'll just put on screen now from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, Levelling Up, and of course the Treasury, very significantly, because all this is about money, really. But within the policy statement on onshore wind, they say they're going to be delivering our clean power mission, and it'll help boost Britain's energy independence, save money on energy bills, support high-skilled jobs, and there we go, tackle the climate crisis. Quite how is something that they don't tend to articulate particularly well. Now, there's quite a bit of detail to go into here, which is very significant, but it does bear close scrutiny because of the ramifications. So what they say is that currently planning policy includes two tests set out in footnotes 57 and 58 to paragraph of the National Planning Policy Framework that apply to onshore wind. Together, they say that development can only be considered acceptable either A, in areas allocated in a development plan or through local development orders, neighbourhood development orders, and community right to build orders. This sets a higher bar than is set for other forms of development. So whilst that might seem out of kilter, in effect, in that it is making a special situation for wind turbines, that there is, of course, a good reason for that, which is their enormous stature, unsightliness, and all the infrastructure that's required to put them up and make them work. And then B, with the narrow exception of proposals brought forward by neighbourhood development orders and community right to build orders, where the proposal has proved community support. Well, how exactly is that accurately measured? In practice, this has often been interpreted to mean that any opposition means the proposal cannot be considered acceptable. So that's what they want to change. And they've gone on to say these policy tests no longer apply. The removal of these tests from planning policy means that onshore wind applications will be treated in the same way as other energy development proposals. Now, that should set alarm bells ringing. We've reported enough now on the approach to using vast tracts of land for, in particular, solar, battery energy storage systems, and in fact, specifically the issue of using best and most versatile farmland, which of course should not ever be part of the programme, but that's very much crept in. So they go on to say on the changes, that the extract they use, that they say that the planning authorities should now not require applicants to demonstrate the overall need for renewable or low carbon energy, and recognise that even small scale projects provide a valuable contribution to significant cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is very significant. So the specific technology that somebody is actually intending to put out there doesn't effectively need to be audited at all, doesn't need to be examined, because it's simply the principle that using a technology that's generally recognised as being green or environmentally friendly or renewable is good enough, and therefore it should be allowed to go ahead. That's a terrible precedent to set, I would argue, a very dangerous one. And then the second point is they say that they would approve the application if its impacts are or can be made acceptable. Well, again, there's an awful lot of room for manoeuvre there in exactly what that might be translated to mean. But nevertheless, once suitable areas for renewable and low carbon energy have been identified in plans, local planning authorities should expect subsequent applications for commercial scale projects outside these areas to demonstrate that the proposed location meets the criteria used in identifying suitable. So again, effectively, that once the precedent set, people will be able to do more or less as they please. Now, the significant point to make with this is that they're trying to encourage new development, but of course they're at a stroke forgetting about all the wind turbines that do exist, and of course the sort of end of life process for it, which we see a great deal of inconsistency in. And we'll just look at a paper from Scotland, the future of onshore wind decommissioning in Scotland. Of course, an awful lot of wind power set out all over Scotland over the last few decades, a lot of which is coming to what's regarded as end of life, and really what is the plan for that. And we have the national grid here effectively trying to fudge the situation and create a story that's really not quite true. So they asked the question, can wind turbine blades be recycled? And I've entitled this Not So Green, because they say that for a form of energy to be considered truly green, where it has a zero or less than zero impact on the environment across its lifespan in terms of waste and emissions, it's important also to consider its end-of-life environmental impact. So therefore, for wind turbines, what does that mean? Whilst it's partially true that some can't be recycled, manufacturers and operators are going to great lengths to ensure they are ultimately as sustainable as possible, finding ways to either recycle, reuse, or rebuild them using recyclable materials in the future. The subtext there is they haven't worked out how to do it, they're not doing it, and so things are basically being dug into the ground. Fiberglass, here we go. Fiberglass is not totally recyclable. It's non-biodegradable, made up of composite, which means it's extremely difficult to process at the point of recycling. Instead, it's usually discarded as waste at landfills or incinerated. Now, the key point with this, of course, is how does it actually manifest in the structure itself? But they go on to say that whilst they're treated as waste, not all of them are destined to landfill, and that some are finding innovative ways to recycle. But is that really the case? And I thought we'd just look at an article from Power Technology and describing it as wind's dirty secret, in which they say that the materials are problematic, and they get to the heart of it, which is effectively that having been designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, the epoxy resin is durable and difficult to break down. The tough coating makes it near impossible to separate the materials comprising a blade. Separating the fibers from the polymer using high temperature results in the degradation of the plastic parts and damage to the glass fibers. So the point with that is that because these fibers and coatings are over the other materials that might on their own be described as recyclable, they're not recyclable because of what they're covered in. So this is, again, as I say, making what they're calling clean power synonymous with climate change is effectively to completely duck the issue now with the changes in planning policy of whether or not something should go there in the first place because it does what it says it's going to do, and also how it can be disposed of. And if they're prepared to do this with wind, then we can consider that all the battery storage setups and all the rest of it's going to go all over the country will have the same sort of slipshod attitude applied.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Now, let's go back to Gaza then, Vanessa. And well, the question is, what happens when the Israeli military gets bored?
Yeah, this is a new article again in Plus 972 Mag, which is an Israeli media outlet. The headline, I'm bored, so I shoot. The Israeli army's approval of free-for-all violence in Gaza. Israeli soldiers describe the near total absence of firing regulations in the Gaza war, with troops shooting as they please, setting homes ablaze and leaving corpses on the streets. So let's see what it says. And it's a very long article. I do recommend people find it. It's not behind a paywall, and it will be in the show notes. 6 sources gave testimony to 972, recounted how Israeli soldiers routinely executed Palestinian civilians simply because they entered an area that the military defined as a kill zone, effectively. The testimonies paint a picture of a landscape littered with civilian corpses, which are left to rot or be eaten by stray animals. The army only hides them from view ahead of the arrival of international aid convoys. 2 of the soldiers also testified to a systematic policy of setting Palestinian homes on fire after occupying them. And if you go to TikTok, you can find multiple videos testifying to this. And here is just one very quick example that was put on Telegram yesterday. So if we just show this one. I mean, basically, this is entertainment, and that includes also the detonating of entire areas, including schools and mosques and hospitals and so on. So continuing with the article, there was total freedom of action, said B, another soldier who served in the regular forces in Gaza for months, including in his battalion's command center. If there is even a feeling of threat, there is no need to explain, you just shoot. When soldiers see someone approaching, it is permissible to shoot at their center of mass, their body, not into the air. He continued, it's permissible to shoot everyone, a young girl or an old woman. And continuing again, A explained that shooting at hospitals, clinics, schools, religious institutions, and buildings of international organizations required higher authorization. But in practice, I can count on one hand the cases where we were told not to shoot. Even with sensitive things like schools, approval feels like only a formality. In general, A continued, the spirit in the operations room was shoot first and ask questions later. That was the consensus. No one will shed a tear if we flatten a house when there was no need, or if we shoot someone, we didn't have to. I mean, this is just extraordinary. And then they go on to talk about the fact that before humanitarian convoys arrived, so this is foreign humanitarian convoys, S noted that the bodies are removed. A D9 Caterpillar bulldozer goes down with a tank and clears the area of corpses, buries them under the rubble and flips them aside so that the convoys don't see it. So that images of people in advanced stages of decay don't come out, he described. I saw a lot of Palestinian civilians, families, women, children, S continued. There are more fatalities than are reported. We are in a small area. Every day, at least one or two civilians are killed because they walked into a no-go area or a kill zone. I don't know who is a terrorist and who is not, but most of them did not carry weapons. And yesterday, basically what is a snuff video was released by Channel 14 in Israel, showing the kind of Unit 8200 types carrying out a drone strike on two children easily under the age of 12, I would say, just looking at the video. One was injured trying to make it to safety. The other is clearly dead in the red T-shirt. And let's just roll this.
אנחנו מצטרפים ליחידת הרחפנים ועדים לדרמה שמתרחשת בלב סג'עיה.
קיבלתי שתי מפחים על צומת אלטול עוברות.
זה אחד החמ"לים המרכזיים בסג'עיה. החבר'ה פה בעצם אנשים שמסתכלים מלמעלה על כל מה שקורה כאן במרחב. יש פה בדקות האחרונות מגיעה אינדיקציה שיש כנראה איזושהי חוליה שמסתתרת פה באחד המבנים ההרוסים. גם אם הוא קם, גם אם הוא זז, גם אם הוא יגיע לאיזשהו מבנה, יהיה עליו מעקב רציף. עד שבסופו של דבר יסגרו עליו מעגל ויחסלו גם אותו. נתעלה לפתח.
I mean, you know, this is just summary execution of anything that moves basically in Gaza. It's just hideous.
Okay, well, indeed. Let's move on then, Charles, to back to Europe and space.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, the announcement by the European Space Agency of what they're calling a successful launch of the Ariane 6 launcher. Now, interestingly, prior to this, there's been a sort of widespread report in the mainstream press about a crisis amongst in sort of the launching capabilities, which, bearing in mind they've been doing this since 1957, does seem quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, this is the picture on the right of the Ariane 6, which effectively has a great payload and can take satellites up into space. Now, we've spoken about this to an extent recently, especially the militarization of space. And I think I just want to join some of the dots on this. Now, one contentious thing, bearing in mind this is being heralded as a sort of European triumph, is that just a couple of weeks previously, the meteorological capability of Europe, which was due to be launched by the Ariane technology, has in fact switched to go to SpaceX. So there's been a few upside down smiles about this. The Meteosat here, we see the satellite to be launched with SpaceX. And the reason this is relevant is because of all the various links to defense. So I've called this climate and defense, and this is just from the meteorological website, saying that it's the first European sounding satellite in a geostationary orbit, and it'll bring a revolution for weather forecasting and climate monitoring in Europe and Africa, and make it possible for the first time to observe the full life cycle of a convective storm from space. Well, I don't think I'm the only person who thinks that there might be a bit more to it than that, because weather forecasting and monitoring systems are already fairly sophisticated, and so it does look rather as though there's another agenda at play, and that follows sort of previous segments. So, from the European Commission going back a few years, this gives the sort of genesis on the fundraising side of it, and talk about the space sector being boosted by investment of 200 million euros coming in on the financing side of it. And of course, this, as always, is the critical part. So when we look at the Ariane Group website and we see their shareholders, which are Airbus and Safran, it describes that they're equally owned by the two groups, and that Ariane Group houses the entire scope of their civil and military launcher activities and competencies in a single coherent company. Well, again, that should, I believe, give some cause for concern, but especially when we consider our own Space Command, UK Space Command, and exactly what they're up to and what the influences are there. They describe themselves as having a mission to protect and defend UK and allied interests in, from, and to space. And on their page, they refer to Skynet being the MOD's satellite communications capability, a family of military communications satellites which provide strategic communications services to the armed forces and its allies. And Skynet 5, with 6 coming, is the most recent generation of the UK military satellites. But of course, what they don't mention is that it is Northrop Grumman and indeed Airbus that are effectively enabling this. And of course, we now know that Airbus certainly has links on the European side of it to the Ariane project. So that in effect, all tentacles cover all bases. And that definitely does have implications for the UK defence side of it. To go into greater detail on this, I would recommend that you go back to 2020 and look at David Ellis's report specifically on Skynet to get a better idea of that. But the other thing I was talking about really was climate and defence, and this idea that climate change is increasing the likelihood of conflict around the world, and therefore to put out technology into space with the specific, or at least the declared purpose of monitoring climate and weather, but in actual fact finding that every single time it links back to defence, is becoming a sort of a well-worn path now. And just to highlight what I mean, I will just point to an announcement made in May, which is to do with £9 million funding for satellite instruments to monitor the climate. This is from the UK Space Agency. And then we look at the detail and we talk about the Earth Explorers programme includes missions such as the European-Japanese Earth Care, due to launch later this month to improve the reliability of climate predictions and weather forecasts. More than a decade in the making, Earth Care has significant UK contributions from Airbus, Defence and Space UK, and of course Thales Alenia Space UK, two well-known defence entities. So one might ask the question, what exactly is it that the defence industry wants to know about the weather that is so actively and aggressively pursuing these sorts of initiatives? Or is there much more to it than that? So this is an area that seems to be very much developing, and I think one that we must look into further as and when the time comes. But of course, also it's one that has very much has a bearing on the sort of accusations against Russia with regard to all their various capabilities, not least nuclear.
And just very briefly, Charles, do you think, what are we looking at here? That there's that old document from the US military about owning the weather for military purposes and warfare purposes. Do you think this is potentially linked to assessing how they are owning the weather, looking at how they're attempting to affect weather on battlefields?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good question. And when I did last deal with this issue of the militarization of space, is exactly what I did look at with some of the sort of treaties and various bits of legislation that do concern that. But of course, like so many of these things, how exactly it's interpreted and what people are able to draw from it and decide what they can and can't do is always a sort of raft of contradictions as people interpret it however they like to. So yes, I mean, good question, and I'm not absolutely sure where it will go, but it does look like, you certainly using space as a tool of war is absolutely on the agenda.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And Vanessa, let's come back to you and the question of prisoners that are in Israel, Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, we only ever hear about I think it's around 120 now hostages inside Gaza. We never hear about the 9,600 Palestinian hostages held in administrative detention or in military jails in the occupied territories. So that's without the potential. I think I've seen numbers around 9,000 also arrested from inside Gaza, and many of those are still in arbitrary detention. This is a recent report by Euromed, a human rights organization. Killing, torture, and injections of unknown substances. The international community must act on Israeli violations of Gaza detainees, and of course that includes sexual abuse, rape, torture by electrical methods, and so on. And this just absolutely shocked me when this sort of came across the media in the last 2 days. Moazaz Obayat from Bethlehem in the occupied territories was arrested 9 months ago and just released. And there you see him on the left as a boxer. He was a sportsman and a boxer. And the other photo is his release. And basically, the Palestinian Prisoners Club put out a short statement. The occupation released the prisoner Moazaz after 9 months of detention, where he was subjected to a systematic assassination attempt. They did try to kill him during his time in Offa prison. He faced systematic and brutal assaults that included the breaking of all his limbs, visible in the circulating videos, and he was left without treatment until his liberation. So I put together a little compilation of the videos that have been circulating in the last 24 hours. And really, you know, every day we see things that shock us and horrify us in Gaza, but this really got to me. So if we can just play this.
في 14 تعرضت لعملية قتل في سجن عوفة. رقص عجزتي بن غفير وأعلن عن قتلي في 14. شهدت في مستشفى الرملة. ما قدموا لنا أي علاج. الوضع سيء جدا جدا. احنا بنموت كل يوم. احنا السجن 2000 واحد بنموت. سجن النقب سجن غوانتنامو. كل شيء لا يتصوره العقل. قتل، ضرب، جوع، فقر، مرض، 2000 أسير، أمراض مزمنة، أمراض قوية جدا، وضعهم سيء جدا.
And I just wanted people to remember the videos, the multiple videos and photos of released hostages from Gaza, and to note the difference. Here, I think, was one of the first hostage releases. You can see basically the resistance forces. You can see that the hostages are in good health, that they have good relationships with their captors who kept them safe under Zionist bombardment. All of them were given food, water, even though Palestinians were starving and without water. You know, I mean, it's so obvious, the difference. And I really want to recommend people watch this interview that Mike and I did a few days ago with Professor David Miller, who goes into enormous depth. I mean, absolutely blew my mind over certain aspects of the Zionist movement in Britain and the extent to which they have infiltrated all sectors of British society and are influencing many of the movements that are manipulating public opinion in the UK. Please do watch it on the basis of the report that I've also just made about the brutality and the savagery of what is a genocidal ethno-supremacist movement.
Yes, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. So, okay, let's come back to the UK. And, Wes Streeting is our new health secretary. So let's bring him on screen because he's talking about what is the future for the health service in the UK. And just as I read through this, just think about this. This is a Labour politician, apparently, So he making it. I've mislabeled this, so I do apologise for the mislabeling of these graphics. I haven't, and you had forgotten something this morning. But anyway, this is West Streeting. So he said, "I want to end the begging bowl culture where the health secretary only ever goes to the Treasury to ask for more money. I want to deliver the Treasury billions of pounds of economic growth." So this is what he's talking about for the health service, becoming a driver of economic growth. The government's agenda for health and social care can help drag our economy out of the sluggish productivity and poor growth of recent years. We will make Britain a powerhouse for life sciences and medical technology. So when Keir Starmer is talking about change, well, Debbie's been reporting on the fact that the Tory government has been wanting to make Britain a powerhouse for life sciences and medical technology over the last dozen years, number of years anyway. And well, nothing is changing here. There's another example of nothing changing. Streeting goes on to say we can develop modern treatments for patients and help get Britain's economy booming. He said the NHS and social care are the biggest employers in most parts of our country. They should be the engines of economic growth, giving opportunities in training and work to local people as well as providing public services. When Keir Starmer said he would lead a mission-driven government, so there's that term again that we heard from Ed Miliband. When Keir Starmer said he would lead a mission-driven government, that's what he meant, working together to a shared mission. This government will get Britain booming. So, Charles, I don't know what you think about that, but it just struck me about how the Labour Party no longer even nearly represents what the Labour Party once did.
No, they don't. Sorry, I thought they don't, Mike. And I think you're absolutely right. It's an extraordinary kind of contortion, but it does go back. I mean, it does go back to the 1940s, and it questions the whole genesis of the NHS and all the resistance to it then. And I think that is something that never should be forgotten, because of course it was only really with the government control and all the safety and security that people were hoping for in relation to their freedom, where have we sort of heard that before? But no, absolutely. And actually, I just might say that it seems like such gobbledygook. In a way, I wouldn't have been surprised if it had been Stoltenberg rather than Wes Streeting that had said it. But no, it's senseless. I suppose I'd be surprised. Those that did vote Labour, I wonder what they make of it. I really do. It seems very, very much out of step.
Yes, indeed. Well, don't worry. Stoltenberg is making another appearance, although he does look a bit like Keir Starmer in a second. So I'm going to apologise for not having the attribution correct on the graphics. But anyway, before we get there, let's just talk about devolution, because yesterday all the Metro mayors were gathered together at Downing Street. This is simply brilliant, says Peter Stefanovic. Metro mayors at Downing Street to meet Prime Minister Keir Starmer, working together to deliver change, the change our cities and country deserve. So the government in their press release talking about all the Metro mayors coming together at Downing Street to begin the process of shifting power out of Westminster through a major programme of devolution that will power up all corners of the country. In their first round table, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister will continue putting into practice the commitment for a reset in relationships between central and regional governments, focusing on public service respect and collaboration. Leaders will come together to discuss a new partnership approach and agree early actions needed to scale up devolution and empower regions to deliver change for their communities, helping to unlock economic growth and tackle regional inequality. But as we've noticed already, they're not delivering change at all. They're delivering the same policy agendas that we've seen under the Tory government. The Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, will also use the meeting to mark the beginning of the process of establishing local growth plans across the country. So Charles behind him had Your Life in Their Hands. If you haven't got a copy of this yet, you need to get one, because that is showing you the foundations of all this stuff that they are pushing through at the moment. So let's bring the misattributed Jens Stoltenberg on screen. In fact, Keir Starmer saying, "My fundamental belief is that those with skin in the game are the ones who know best what they need. That's why for many years I've been in constant dialogue with metro mayors across the country about what works for their areas, and I will continue that now as Prime Minister. It's also why I've made it a priority to meet with all metro mayors in my first week of Prime Minister by resetting these crucial relationships and putting more power in the hands of local leaders. I'm determined to make sure they have the support they need to play their part in delivering growth in every part of the country. This devolution agenda is part and parcel of Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. We shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing it being pursued vigorously by this Prime Minister and this government. We'll be reporting much more on this in the coming days and weeks. So, well, we've got to leave it there for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa and Charles for joining me today. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back in a couple of minutes if you're a UK column member for some extra. But otherwise, don't forget the interview at 1 p.m. tomorrow. And we'll be back for another news programme at 1 p.m. as usual on Friday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.